Let's continue doing the same refactoring and turn some tests from other files into data-driven tests. Let's start with rotor.test.ts. In the first testing scenario from this file, we are seeing that the loop is used, and this is another sign that this test can be turned into data-driven test. And by data-driven or parameterized test, I mean the test which uses method called each with all the data necessary to run this test. So I'm simply going to call method each and pass this expression, which is going to return an array with page names. In that array, we're going to have 3 strings. Every time I'm going to output current string in this place, as well as take this string as a first parameter into the testing function. And then we no longer need to use loop in here, so we can simply remove this loop, and the rest of code can remain the same. In the terminal, we're going to see that that test has been executed 3 times, every time with a different value of the page name variable. Moving on, and if we'll take a look at the next test, this test can remain the same since it doesn't make sense to turn this test into data-driven, so we can move on to the next testing file, time.test.ts. This file contains lots of examples where we can use parameterized tests. Let's start from the very beginning. In here I'm gonna call method each. Let's not forget to import test object from the Vitest library. And since we're gonna need 3 different date objects to run the first test, I'm gonna extract all these date objects and put them as the first element of these arrays. This is the initial date we're going to use in order to execute the test. And as the second element of these arrays will be the date that we're expecting to get after executing the function after the test. By the way, in this case, these 2 dates are the same, and technically we could have used only one date object, but I'm gonna keep both to make it clear that the first date is used as an initial date, and the second one is used as an expected date. And as we usually do in such cases, let's change the description where we'll mention which function is executed during this test. Here I'm also gonna use a couple of special characters to format the data from those arrays and accept a couple of arguments. So the first date object we're about to receive is the initial date, and the second one is an expected date. Then we no longer need to define these 3 dates in here, since it is going to be passed as arguments into this testing function. And then I will remove duplicate instructions and keep only 3 lines in this test. But of course we have to pass these parameters into respective calls instead of using hard-coded values. So now that we are done with refactoring the first test, let's move on to the next one. In here I also start with calling method each, and then I'm going to take these dates one by one and put them into these arrays, so that later we're gonna be able to drastically reduce amount of lines in the testing function. Once the whole data is prepared, I'll change the description of this test and mention the function that we are testing. It's called tomorrow. Then I'll also use a couple of special symbols to interpolate date objects, and then I'll receive these date objects as parameters into this testing function. And then we don't need to define these dates in the test. Let's remove all these variable initializations and remove similar lines from the testing function. There will be exact same steps that we are going to do with the next test. As always, first of all, I'll call method each, and then I'll grab the data that we need to run this test and put it inside these arrays. The first element will be the initial date, and the second one will be an expected date that the first date has to be turned into after test execution. And as you may notice, these parameterized tests usually lead to removing the first phase of the test, where we are preparing the data, because data preparation has been moved outside of the testing function, and we are doing it separately by calling method each and passing all necessary data as array. So let's get rid of all these variable initializations and keep only one expectation. Then I'll rename description of this test and mention which function we're calling inside the test. And then I'm gonna forward all data that we are receiving as parameters into the testing function, into corresponding function calls, end of hour, as well as to equal. For the next test, I'm not gonna use data-driven approach, but here we also have some duplication. Let's just remove these extra expectations, since I think having only 2 expectations in this test will be enough. And finally, let's do the same refactoring for the last test. I'm going to quickly go through all that procedure once again. Firstly, let's extract all necessary values from these expectations, group them together into these arrays. As always, the first element of the array is an initial data we're passing to the function that we are testing, and the second element of these arrays is an expected value, return value of that function. This test is checking function 2 seconds. Let's accept a couple of parameters, and then let's forward both of these parameters into function calls inside this testing function, like this. So we have done quite a lot of changes in this file, but those changes were pretty similar. So before finishing this lesson, let's just take a look in the terminal to make sure our tests are still passing. And also I'm gonna check all tests in the project. They are also passing. Link to the source code will be in the video description.